The slap echoed through the diner like a gunshot. The woman staggered backward, coffee spilling across the worn floor. No one moved, no one spoke. At a corner table sat a man in faded military fatigues, a disciplined K-9 lying silent at his feet. No reaction, no movement, not a single word. The man wearing the badge had grown used to silence in this town. Used to fear, used to people looking away. Authority had made him believe he was untouchable. That belief was about to be shattered. The limits he challenged belonged to a Special Forces veteran who knew exactly when to strike. Before we go further, if this story moves you, please hit that like button, drop a comment below, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Kindness Valley so we can keep bringing you stories that matter. Late autumn in western Colorado didn't arrive with romance. It came like a cold warning that sank into everything, into the thin mountain air, into the wood frames of old buildings, into the breath that turned white the moment it left your mouth. A weak, pale sun hid behind thick clouds, and the highway cut through the foothills in long gray stretches bordered by pines and patches of early snow that looked more like ash than winter. The town was the kind travelers missed if they blinked. One main road, a few dim storefronts, and a roadside diner sitting at the edge of gravel and wind, its neon sign stuttering in and out like it was deciding whether to stay alive. Inside that diner, warmth existed only because the heater fought hard. People spoke softly because they'd learned that volume attracted the wrong kind of attention. Daniel Brooks rolled in without drama, an old pickup crunching across the lot, tires spitting stones, engine ticking as it cooled. He sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, shoulders relaxed, chin slightly lowered, eyes taking in the windows, the door. The lone cruiser parked a little too confidently near the side of the building. Daniel was 34, tall and lean-muscled, the kind of strength that looked understated until it moved. His sandy blonde hair was cut short in a strict military style, tight at the sides. Short on top, a short boxed beard framed his jaw, neat and clipped. A thin, pale scar ran along his jawline like an old punctuation mark. His hazel eyes had the steady watchfulness of a man trained to notice what others missed. But his face carried no invitation to conversation, no threat either, just presence, controlled and quiet. He wore a Navy working uniform, NW type III, green blouse and trousers, Velcro patches blank, no name, no rank, no insignia, tan combat boots dusted with road grit. He looked like someone who had left a place in a hurry and hadn't bothered to become anyone else yet. At his left side, the K-9 moved as if the cold couldn't touch him. The Belgian Malinois was 5 years old. Compact and powerfully built with a fawn coat laid under a dark black overlay along his back and face that made his amber eyes seem even darker when he focused. The dog's chest was broad. His legs spring-loaded, his posture disciplined, no wasted motion, no nervous scanning. Only a calm, professional readiness shaped by repetition and trust. He wore a worn leather collar. Plain and functional. Later, he'd use a matte black tactical harness, but tonight it was only the collar. The dog's identity kept quiet the same way Daniel kept his. The Malinois stayed close without crowding, matching Daniel's pace, head level, ears reading the world. He wasn't a pet drifting beside his owner. He was a working partner who understood silence as a tool. Daniel stepped out, the wind catching the hem of his blouse, and together they crossed the gravel and pushed into the diner. The bell above the door gave a thin, tired jingle that didn't carry much cheer. Warmth hit first, then smell. Burnt coffee, old grease, a faint sweetness from something overcooked hours ago. And the low murmur of people trying to keep their lives small. The diner was narrow, with cracked vinyl booths, scuffed linoleum, and a counter that had been wiped so many times the surface looked permanently tired. Near the windows sat 4 immigrant workers. Late 20s to early 40s, faces worn by outdoor labor and long hours. Their jackets were heavy, their hands rough, their voices kept low in Spanish. Not because they were ashamed, but because they had learned in places like this that being noticed could become a problem faster than it became a kindness. Behind the counter moved Lena Parker. Early 30s, tall and slender with a quiet, tired grace. Auburn hair pulled into a loose bun that never stayed neat for long. She had pale skin freckled lightly across her nose. green eyes that carried softness, but also the guarded patience of someone who'd learned to keep her reactions inside her chest. Lena was polite to everyone in the way people become polite when politeness is armor. She smiled even when she didn't feel it, apologized even when she wasn't at fault, and moved through the space with shoulders slightly rounded, as if she'd spent years trying not to take up too much room. There was an old story in that posture. An ex-husband who left, and a custody fight that taught her how quickly a woman's truth could be dismissed in a small town. So now she worked hard, spoke softly, and survived by not giving powerful men a reason to turn their attention toward her. Daniel chose a corner booth with his back to the wall, a habit that didn't announce itself as tactical unless someone knew what they were looking at. The Malinois slipped under the table and lay flat, chin on paws, nearly invisible. Present but not displayed, because discipline meant being ready without being theatrical. When Lena came over, Daniel ordered the cheapest breakfast item on the menu in a steady, polite voice. No extra words. He ate slowly when it arrived, methodically, cutting each piece with an economy of motion. Halfway through, he slid a portion down for the dog. The Malinois accepted it without sound, tail barely moving, chewing with controlled restraint, the kind of quiet that came from training and from knowing his handler's expectations were absolute. The bell over the door rang again, sharper this time, and the diner's murmur thinned the way a room changes when something unwanted enters. Mark Holloway stepped inside, and he didn't look like a man who ever asked permission to exist. Holloway was in his late 40s, tall enough to loom and heavy through the chest and waist, his deputy uniform worn like possession rather than service. His cheeks were ruddy, his nose slightly swollen, his eyes small and restless, and his thinning dark hair was slicked back with too much product, an attempt at control that couldn't hide years of drinking. A short, uneven beard clung to his jaw, more neglect than style, and the lines around his mouth pulled downward into a permanent impatience, as if the world owed him comfort and he resented it every moment it didn't pay. His sidearm sat at his hip, and his hand drifted near the grip in an almost lazy way. Not because he feared anything in this diner, but because he enjoyed the reminder of what the badge and the weapon made possible. He didn't greet the owner. He didn't nod at the customers. He looked at people the way you look at furniture you expect to obey you. A couple of locals went still. The immigrant workers dropped their eyes toward their cups. Lena's hands tightened around a coffee pot for half a beat, then she forced them loose again, because in her body lived a memory of what happened when she showed fear or anger. Holloway sat at the counter and barked an order without saying please, then laughed once at something no one else could hear, loud and sudden. A laugh that landed like a slap even before his hand ever moved. Lena moved quickly, careful, her steps measured, her voice soft. She set the mug down, and for a moment everything looked like it would pass the way it always passed. Quiet, ugly, survivable, until her elbow clipped the edge of the pot. Coffee splashed across the counter, a few drops hitting Holloway's sleeve. The slap sounded like a crack of wood breaking, sharp enough to cut through the diner's stale air. Lena's head snapped to the side, and she stumbled half a step, her bun loosening, a strand of auburn hair falling across her cheek. Her face went still in the stunned way bodies go still when they are trying to decide whether pain is real or whether admitting it will make it worse. A red mark bloomed instantly along her cheekbone. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. Her hand rose halfway, then stopped, hovering as if touching her face might turn the moment into something officially true. Holloway stood over her, breath thick with alcohol and contempt, eyes bright with the satisfaction of being watched and not challenged. "Watch what you're doing," he said, voice loud enough for everyone, the tone of a man performing power. "You people get lazy when you think nobody's paying attention." No one spoke. The cook stayed hidden in the kitchen. A local man in a booth stared down at his plate like it contained instructions for survival. One of the immigrant workers clenched his jaw so hard the muscle jumped, but he kept his hands wrapped around his cup, because he knew how fast a town could turn against someone without paperwork. Without witnesses, without consequence. Lena swallowed, straightened slowly, and forced a small apology that didn't belong to her, because she had learned that apologies sometimes bought you time. Daniel saw it all and did not move. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. His posture remained easy, shoulders relaxed, hands calm, eyes steady on Holloway without the heat of anger, without the softness of pleading. Under the table, the Malinois tightened like a drawn wire, his muscles shifting beneath his short coat, his amber eyes locking on Holloway's boots. A low vibration of readiness humming in his chest. Daniel's foot pressed lightly against the dog's shoulder, barely a touch, a private signal, and the Malinois stayed down, disciplined, silent. Because he had been trained to wait for permission the way other dogs waited for food, Daniel's silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint, a controlled decision not to feed the scene with reaction. But Mark Holloway didn't understand restraint. In Holloway's world, the loud ruled and the quiet submitted. He turned then, scanning the diner for eyes that looked away, for bodies that flinched. And his gaze landed on Daniel, on the blank Velcro patches, the calm face, the dog hidden under the booth, the absence of apology in Daniel's posture. Holloway misread the stillness as fear and the quiet as surrender, and something in his expression curled into a smirk. The look of a man who had found a new object to press down just to prove he could. Daniel held his gaze without challenging it, without lowering his eyes either. Present in a way that didn't beg and didn't threaten. The Malinois stayed flat beneath the table like a shadow that had learned discipline. Holloway's smirk widened. Because to him, silence was an invitation. In that instant, he decided the stranger in the corner booth was the next lesson this town would watch without intervening. What Holloway didn't know was that Daniel Brooks wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a stranger passing through. He was Lena's younger brother, the one she hadn't seen in 3 years. The one who had joined Special Forces at 19 and disappeared into missions she couldn't ask about. The one who had promised her, a long time ago, that if she ever needed him, he would come. She had called that number 2 weeks ago, left a voicemail she wasn't even sure he'd get, said she was scared, said things were getting worse, said she didn't know what else to do. And Daniel had come, not with sirens, not with speeches, just quietly, the way he did everything. Holloway advanced on Daniel now, crowding the space deliberately, his hand still near the gun. "Funny," he said, eyes narrowing, "you don't look like most drifters." The words were bait, and the room knew it. Daniel did not answer, because he understood that explanations were invitations. And invitations could be twisted into permissions. Silence, used correctly, was a boundary. Holloway's gaze dropped briefly toward the dog, lips curling. "Big animal," he said. "Yours, yes," Daniel replied, the single word measured, final. For a moment, Holloway said nothing. And in that moment, the diner held its breath again. Each person calculating what the next movement would cost them. Then Holloway raised his hand and struck Daniel across the face, open-palmed and vicious. The sound snapping through the diner like a board breaking under sudden weight. Daniel staggered half a step, more from surprise than pain, the taste of iron blooming briefly on his tongue. But he did not raise his hands, and he did not reach for Holloway, because instinct and discipline both told him that the second after impact was where men made irreversible mistakes. Beneath the table, the Belgian Malinois surged to his feet in a blur of muscle and intent, a low growl rolling up from his chest, raw and immediate, his body angled forward. Weight shifting to his front legs, every line of training screaming that his handler had been attacked. Daniel's voice cut through the sound before it could become something else. "Stay," firm and precise. A single command delivered without volume but with absolute authority, and the dog stopped mid-motion, muscles still quivering, ears pinned forward, eyes locked on Holloway. While his body lowered back to the floor, obedience wrestled into place by years of repetition and trust. A ripple of shock moved through the diner. Lena froze behind the counter with one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide, not just with fear, but with the recognition that something had crossed from the familiar cruelty she endured into open violence that could not be dismissed as an accident or a misunderstanding. Holloway smiled. A short, ugly curve of the mouth that fed on reaction, and he raised his hand again, enjoying the moment, enjoying the power of being able to strike a man who did not beg or break. Daniel shifted then, not forward and not in anger, but sideways, turning just enough that the second blow cut through empty air. Holloway's momentum carrying him past balance as his boot caught the edge of a chair leg. The space was too tight. The diner, too, crowded with bodies and furniture for recovery. And Holloway went down hard, crashing into a table, plates clattering and shattering across the floor, coffee sloshing and spilling as he hit the linoleum in a tangle of limbs and fury. For a fraction of a second, no one breathed. Holloway pushed himself up, his face flushing a deeper red, and his hand flew to his sidearm, fingers wrapping the grip as the metallic click of the holster echoed louder than it should have in the confined space. "On the ground!" he shouted, voice cracking with rage and authority intertwined. "You're resisting," the words came automatically. A charge built to justify whatever followed. Daniel did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not attempt to explain physics or intent to a man who was no longer listening. Slowly and deliberately, he lowered himself to the floor, lying flat on his stomach, hands moving behind his back in a controlled motion that communicated compliance without surrender. "Stay," Daniel said quietly, the word meant for the Malinois alone, and the dog obeyed, lowering himself again with rigid discipline, eyes never leaving Holloway, his body a coiled line of restraint held in place by command rather than fear. Holloway advanced, knee pressing into Daniel's back as he forced the man's wrists together, the cuffs snapping shut with unnecessary force. Each click a declaration meant to be heard and remembered. Outside, the Malinois was halted at the threshold by Holloway's shouted order. Another deputy stepping forward to grab the dog's collar and loop a length of rope around a metal post near the diner's entrance. The deputy was older, heavier, with tired eyes and a resigned posture. Someone who had learned to follow instructions because resistance had not paid off in a long time. He avoided the dog's gaze as he tied the knot, hands efficient, apologetic without words. And the Malinois stood still through it all, chest rising and falling, eyes tracking Daniel as he was pushed toward the cruiser, because training did not erase loyalty, it only taught it patience. Daniel was placed in the back seat, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed down the empty stretch of road. And as the cruiser pulled away, the diner was left behind in a silence that felt heavier than before. But this time, the silence didn't last. Lena sank onto a stool behind the counter, her cheeks still burning, her mind racing through the consequences she had always feared and now could no longer avoid. Then she remembered something. The phone number Daniel had slipped under his plate. She pulled it from her apron pocket, stared at it for a long moment, and then she made the call, not to Daniel, but to the contact he had left her. A federal investigator, someone outside this town's grip, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I want to report a pattern of abuse by Deputy Mark Holloway." "And I have evidence?" What happened next unfolded quietly, but with precision. Federal investigators arrived within 48 hours. They reviewed security footage, interviewed witnesses, collected recordings that the diner's owner, George Miller, had been secretly keeping for years. Holloway was arrested, not by his own department, but by agents who didn't owe him anything. Daniel was released without charges, and when he walked out of that station, the Malinois was waiting, calm, disciplined, ready. They didn't stay in town long after that. But before they left, Daniel stopped by the diner one last time. Lena met him at the door, and for the first time in years, she stood tall, without fear, without apology. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "You did this, I just showed up." And then he was gone, back on the road, back to wherever men like him go when the work is done. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive with noise, with thunder, with clear signs that cannot be ignored. But this story reminds us that God often works in quieter ways. Not through sudden power, but through restraint. Not through revenge, but through truth that refuses to disappear. Daniel didn't win because he was stronger, louder, or more violent. He won because he stood still when fear demanded silence, because he chose patience when anger would have been easier, and because he trusted that doing what was right would matter. Even if no one applauded. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you that quiet integrity still carries weight, that goodness does not need permission to exist, and that even unseen choices can shift the ground beneath a broken place. Please share this story so others who feel powerless may find hope. Leave a comment to let someone know they are not alone. Subscribe to Kindness Valley so more stories of truth and courage can be told. And if you believe that God still works through patience, restraint, and faith, comment, Amen. May God bless you, protect you, and walk with you through every silent battle you face.